as well. Before we get that started, just to give me some sort of a hint on the audience, how many of you are actually SharePoint developers? Half of the audience, and probably the rest of are kind of curious on what's the latest on SharePoint, or their manager asked them to check what's up with the SharePoint, which is completely understandable. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a principal program manager nowadays in Microsoft. I joined Microsoft back in 2006 and have worked on SharePoint since then. So I started as a consultant, then went to senior principal, then PM, and eventually landed as a principal PM now in engineering. I do own open source SharePoint development guidance, all of our open source projects, community engagement, partner engagement, documentation. So if there's any guidance which is lacking or there's mistakes in the docs.microsoft.com documentation, I'm the guy to blame. So you can actually come to the expo and then point on me and say, you need to fix this, and I'll fix that. So feedback is absolutely welcome. Now, before we actually go to the actual content, just to quickly set the scene, what I wanted to do with this presentation is not really deep dive on how to make SharePoint framework solutions, rather give you an ideas what you can do nowadays and what is possible using the SharePoint framework, because we do have an awesome set of tutorials and videos and guidance available in the internet for you to take advantage. But you need to understand what's possible and how you can act, what you can build using SharePoint framework and what's possible with the modern portals. So I'm trying to give you an ideas what's possible and giving you insights on the assets which we actually have available. Now, this is the second day of the Microsoft build, and obviously everything in the Microsoft 365 developer platform is around the people-centric thinking. And this actually is in line with the SharePoint as well. SharePoint is kind of a, how would I put it, it's kind of a different kind of a beast, so to say, because it has such a long historical legacy. SharePoint actually has started of being as a product since 2001, and then it grew to be the massive product what it is back in 2007. It is now 2019, which is actually horrifying. It's 12 years from that moment. But we're kind of now in the progress, well, we've actually done the switch already to transform SharePoint to be natively also cloud-centric and people-centric as well. So really concentrating and aligning the messaging around the SharePoint, around the other development platform areas as well. And SharePoint falls on the Microsoft 365 developer platform, so it is all around Microsoft Graph, getting access on personalized information, showing the relevant information through the SharePoint UIs as well, and taking advantage of the SharePoint framework. And I'll walk through with multiple demos during today what does that mean in practice. Now, with SharePoint, we released a new way of doing SharePoint development actually 3 years ago. 3 years ago, pretty much 3 years ago, 4th of May, 3 years ago, we actually demonstrated and announced SharePoint Framework. And SharePoint Framework was something which we announced to be in preview 3 years ago, and it went GA 2.5 years ago already. And that was a new development model. It was a completely new way of doing customizations and extensibility on top of SharePoint. And if you are a classic SharePoint developer, it actually freaked a lot of people out, because people are used to do really complex XMLs, and they were used to have this SharePoint. There was a lot of SharePoint isms to make SharePoint customizations. And with SharePoint Framework, we actually transformed this not to be anymore true, because any web developer can be now a SharePoint developer. And at the same time, every SharePoint developer who's doing SharePoint Framework customizations is also a web developer, which is a good thing, because you're no longer restricted only to be a SharePoint developer. Now, with SharePoint and SharePoint Framework, it's really around building customizations and extensibility using the classic web part story, and then having a SharePoint Framework extensions over there. And after we have released the SharePoint Framework, it's really been taking off. So even 2.5 years after the release of SharePoint Framework, we're still growing at the level of 373% in a year-to-year growth. And that's insane. It's now by far the #1 UI extensibility model in Office 365. And it's getting now adapted by other products as well, which is really, really cool. And I'm going to talk about that one slightly later within this session. But now, within 2.5 years, 10 major releases, and still growth of 373% year-over-year growth. That's insane. And actually, the growth figures are just keep on growing. It's exponentially getting adapted by our enterprise customers and our partners for writing extensibility on top of SharePoint. Now, If you're not really familiar with SharePoint Framework, I'm going to do a quick recap, but then let's actually concentrate on the new stuff as well. But SharePoint Framework is really a modern client-side development experience. So we use Node.js, we use NPM. You can choose what JavaScript framework you want to use to implement the extensibility. So you can use React, Angular, Vue, whatever, Knockout if you want, jQuery if you're a jQuery person. And you basically are able to build an extensibility on top of SharePoint in a governed way. No longer people are able to just add, or the intention is that people are not meant to add ad hoc scripts on the SharePoint, which is actually quite often compromising the platform as well, because that's a classical challenge within the SharePoint in the past as well. It's a lightweight and web mobile, so everything is natively responsive. And a super important thing, it powers our own experiences. This is the first time in SharePoint history when actually we in engineering are using exactly the same tooling to build the UIs of the SharePoint. In the past, we had farm solutions, and yeah, we kind of used it in engineering, but you used it in a different way. You created a WSP packages and feature XMLs, but we were not really using the same model. Then we introduced SharePoint adding model, which was completely an extensibility model on top of SharePoint, but we didn't use that. We told you to use that. And then that wasn't, to be honest, highly successful either. Now, with SharePoint Framework, we actually used exactly the same code base, exactly the same APIs, exactly the same extensibility and versions, which you use to extend the SharePoint. And that's a massive deal, because that also means that it's not like we're going to introduce a new model next year. Nope, that's not our intention, because we build on top of SharePoint Framework. So it's a safe to bet on the model. We're not going to introduce a new model next year, and hopefully I'm not wrong with the statement, but let's see. So it's backward compatible, so if you build anything on SharePoint Framework version 1.0, it still works in SharePoint Online after 2.5 years or 3 years now. So we guarantee that it's backward compatible. We do not break you, and that's a massive deal as well, even in this modern way of doing extensibility and JavaScript implementations. So quite often, if you build your own, let's say, single-page applications which are hosted in Azure, you always want to keep up to date on the latest and greatest. But in the enterprise scenarios, it's not like we can demand our enterprise customers to update to React 16 or 16.3 to keep up with SharePoint. No. We have to guarantee that it's backward compatible. So if you build your extensibility using SharePoint Framework, it's going to be working in SharePoint Online for years to come still. And that is, by the way, an interesting engineering challenge for us to figure out, but it's working quite all right for now, at least. And it obviously supports open source tools and JavaScript web frameworks. You choose which framework you use. We do not tell you what is the best. We do use React in the SharePoint engineering, because that was the chosen framework 2.5 years ago when we started building our SharePoint Framework tooling. But you can just as well use Angular, Vue.js, and whatever is the new best ever JavaScript framework, which is coming next week in the JavaScript development. Now, on top of, obviously, on the web parts, classic ways of doing customizations, we also have a capability called SharePoint Framework extensions. So we're able to actually embed JavaScript in the UI areas of the page. And there's more and more placeholders and locations where you can basically put your widgets to be running as a static place or static functionality on the page. So it's not just about web parts, and that's just about the end users adding a web part on a page. You're able to embed, for example, headers and footers and other functionalities inside of the modern capabilities and inside of the modern SharePoint functionalities. The command sets are there for adding menu buttons and list view buttons to lists. So when you're selecting an item, you can click a button, and that executes your JavaScript, which can then call, for example, Azure functions in a secure way and execute something over there. And then Field Customizer is for rendering the UI in the field level. Now, that's really cool. That's really cool that we are now moving into this industry standard tooling. We're using Node.js, NPM, or Yarn, whatever is your preference on this tooling. But obviously, when we're building stuff in SharePoint, the number one thing always to remember that there's a lot of out-of-the-box capabilities. And this is kind of a reminder also on the fact that the SharePoint isn't anymore the SharePoint what you might have think it is a few years back, because SharePoint UIs is completely modernized as well. And what it means is that when we're building something, we need to also understand some of the out-of-the-box capabilities and the thinking behind of those. So SharePoint's role in the future is really around custom portals and the communicational portals in the companies. And these things are then built using the SharePoint News. We're building them using communication sites, which are basically modern sites with the modern experiences, no postbacks, no refreshes of the page. Everything is happening fluently, which is a good thing. And then you are able to group those communication sites using a hub site. So you're able to create divisional portals with multiple sites under the same navigation, under the same branding, under the same extensibility. And obviously, a big thing for SharePoint in the future is absolutely the intranet landing pages as well. So we're investing heavily on the landing pages to give a out-of-the-box capabilities, but also giving you as a developer capabilities of extending those landing pages in a meaningful way. On the landing pages, there's a lot of functionalities, out-of-the-box functionalities, which are available. So obviously, you're able to do those news, you're able to do personalized and relevant content. There's a lot of out-of-the-box web parts. If needed, you can take advantage of those, or you're able to extend those welcome pages as well. You're able to create actionable experiences, so praising content like my documents, or my emails, or my calendars, partly using extensibility, partly using out-of-the-box functionalities. And it's really around exposing the relevant information for the employees of the company. And this is really the core of the SharePoint in the future as well. If you think about the positioning of the SharePoint in this larger Microsoft 365 ecosystem. Now, on that one, I want to make sure that we have few assets which you are aware, and this might be something if you're a core developer, you might not be super interested on this, but let me actually explain the value of this stuff. So, SharePoint Lookbook is one asset which we released back in last Ignite. So SharePoint Lookbook.azurewebsites.net, there's quite a few AKMS addresses for getting there, but it actually gives you an idea what's possible with the modern SharePoint, with out of the box, because that's always the important thing to remember. What's possible with out of the box, and then let's extend on top of it. And what's really cool about this site is that it actually explains how these things have been built. So as an example, I can go to this landing page, intranet homepage, and it actually shows me insights, what's available, and how the landing page has been built. So you're able to copy the structure and thinking behind of those landing pages, and then add your own extensibility where needed. Or if I scroll down, you can actually see nice examples of portal sites and communicational sites, how to build nice looking modern portals with using the extensibility which is out of the box actually in this case. Cool. Okay, so that's the out of the box functionality, and the SharePoint Lookbook is a great asset for finding what's available for out of the box. But this is a Microsoft Build conference. So obviously we are interested on what's the partner opportunity and how do we extend those out-of-the-box functionalities. And how does the SharePoint framework actually relate on this discussion? Well, like I said, the role of SharePoint is really around those modern portals. And we have multiple ways of extending those modern portals by adding web parts, adding custom headers, embedding JavaScript here and there, including extensibility based on the business requirements of the customers. And we provide actually quite a lot of open source projects and experiences which you can adapt when you're building your own experiences for your customers, either internal or externals. So we have a SharePoint Starter Kit, which I'm going to show in a second, and there's SharePoint Patterns and Practices Initiative, which have multiple projects available for you to take advantage from a code perspective and a sample perspective. There's also a lot of ISV samples and ISV solutions available if you don't want to invest your own time on this extensibility. Now, everything in modern SharePoint is being built using also the UI fabric. So UI fabric has a big role in the SharePoint still, and this role is going to actually grow in the future. We're still in the process of kind of aligning the UI fabric then on the Microsoft Fluent designs and all of that, and that's happening as we move along on this journey. But UI fabric is a great asset for all of the developers to take advantage because it provides you reusable code which will make your code look like out-of-the-box code. So basically elements and controls which will ensure that your extensibility will be in line with what we built in the SharePoint engineering. It also, if you're more interested on the designer side of the story, it also have toolkits for the designers, so you're able to actually design those UIs when you're having discussions with the customers. And there's a new set of documentation for both available from the UIFabric.io, and that documentation has been, by the way, updated this yesterday. Today is Tuesday. On Monday of this week, so there's a new website available how to take advantage of all of those controls. Now, that's the UI Fabric part. Then what we wanted to do together with open source community, and our open source community in SharePoint is super, super strong and super active. So one of the things what we've been building for quite a long time is also the PnP SPFx reusable open source controls. And I'll show what all of this means in practice in a second as well. But these will help you to actually improve your productivity as a developer. And so what we provide is a set of additional controls which are built on top of the Fabric controls. The Fabric controls do not understand anything about SharePoint. These controls do. So as an example, there's taxonomy picker for web part extensibility or web part property pane. So if you need to have an experience where the end user is picking a taxonomy property, there's a web taxonomy picker which is taking care of all of the plumbing. You don't need to understand where the taxonomy is coming. You just put it on a web part and it renders itself automatically. So they're context aware and they're aware of the users in the context of the SharePoint. Or if you use the list picker web part or list picker property pane control, it is actually showing the lists from the sites automatically based on the configuration what you actually provide. So add-on controls to improve your productivity as the developer. Definitely worthwhile of checking out how these are, what these are actually providing. Now, let's do a quick demo on what does that mean then in practice. So I showed you the lookbook site, and then we talked about the SharePoint Starter Kit. For those who are not aware what is the SharePoint Starter Kit, this is a open source reference solution which we released back in SBC 2018. And we've been updating this solution since. What it actually has is a roughly 15 web parts, custom web parts, which are extending the out-of-the-box functionality, extending those capabilities which are natively included in the modern SharePoint. And all of this is obviously available in the GitHub. So everything is open source, and you're able to install this to any tenant in the world relatively easily. If you're not aware of this, let me actually zoom in. So github.com/SharePoint/SP Starter Kit, it is actually the URL to get access on this stuff. And we keep on evolving this as we release newer versions of the native SharePoint capabilities, so we evolve this one together with first-party experiences. Now, this is really designed for you as a developers to learn how we can extend SharePoint. It actually has more than 15 custom web parts, out-of-the-box source code available, on top of out-of-the-box source code available, and capabilities like personal emails. So we are able to actually provide a web part, which is a personal email web part, for end users as long as the solution has been installed. And the example is the solution is relatively easily installable by you directly from GitHub by using PowerShell commands, which basically, as simple as 2 different commands, you're able to get this one up and running in any tenant. Now, what does it actually do in practice is that we show and demonstrate how an imaginary custom portal on top of out-of-the-box portal experiences could look like. And it has a combination of custom first-party experiences and first-party web parts, and a custom web parts built on top of it. So capabilities like the extending footer, which we showed in the SBC last year in a keynote, capabilities like personalized links, and how do you implement all of this. And source code available for you as a reference implementation to take advantage. What's really cool about this solution also is that it shows capabilities like how can I access Microsoft Graph-based information using the SharePoint. So here, if I move to this another page, we can actually see multiple web parts which are accessing the contextual data like Microsoft Graph related data around the meetings of a particular user and upcoming meetings or the upcoming tasks, or the emails which the person actually has not read. And everything is open source, everything is available for you under MIT license, so you can actually reuse the source code any way you want within your implementations. All of this is really behind, and everything has been implemented using the SharePoint framework. And that was really the core story and core concentration of this session as well. And what's really cool about the SharePoint framework is that it actually abstracts the complexity of the Microsoft Graph and Azure AD permissions and configurations and all of that. So you don't actually have to worry about calling somebody in Azure team and say, hey, I need to have a web application. I need to have these and these permissions. No, you don't need to actually do that. Everything is automatic with SharePoint framework. And this is part of the latest, starting from 1.6 release of SharePoint framework, you're able to actually define the needed scopes of your web parts directly within your source code. And this capability is basically giving you a way as a developer to define that I have a custom solution. And this custom solution is dependent on these Microsoft Graph resources and these scopes which should be available. What it means then in practice is that when a user or a tenant administrator is installing your solution, they will actually get permission requests in their Office 365 Admin Center to approve. And in this case, what we've done is that we basically approved from the tenant admin UIs, not from the Azure side, not the Azure team. The tenant admin UIs of Office 365 is able to actually manage these permissions, which simplifies, again, the deployment, operations, and governance of your solutions which are running in SharePoint. Because, again, I don't need to call another person and trying to figure out what are the permissions and what's the configuration in Azure. And the Azure UI is changing all the time, and it's difficult to find how it actually works. You don't have to do that. Everything is available in the modern SharePoint admin UIs, just going to the API management, and you're able to manage those settings and the permissions and scopes around your solution. Now, the reason why this is super important is that we're actually already seeing how we see a lot of customizations and extensibility built on top of the modern SharePoint, which is taking advantage then of the Microsoft Graph APIs. And as long as you have granted those permissions in the central admin of the tenant admin of the tenant, your code can then access any information related on the user. Is it then emails or calendars or any other information available from Graph? So the simplification, once again, of the development experience, which is really, really cool. Good. Now, let me move back on the slides for a second. Quite a few demos and quite a few walkthrough. I'm giving you an ideas, again, on the things what you can do. Now, that's really cool. The SharePoint Starter Kit is quite cool, and the SharePoint Lookbook sites are actually kind of cool. But one of the classic challenges what we've been having related on our demos, what we do in Ignite or in SPC or in Build, is the fact that they're UIs, they're things what I demonstrate, but how could you easily actually reuse all of those assets and all of those experiences within your deployment or within your pre-sales engagement? I used to be a consultant, and what was my role always is that I go to a customer and then I need to show cool-looking UIs and experiences. So having a demo environment like Starter Kit or the Lookbook sites would be insanely powerful. And that's something what we're working right now in our platform team together with our community. And we've released a SharePoint provisioning service. And this is a relatively new capability released in within the last month to preview, which is actually giving you the option as a consultant or as a developer to demonstrate or provision sample content to any tenant in the world. Right now, it is still in the beta status or in preview status, and I'm going to show that in practice in the UIs in a second. But we're moving into the GA relatively soon as we polish the experience and make sure that everything is working properly. But the whole point of this one is really the fact that quite often you need to convince your manager or you need to convince your customer that the modern SharePoint is actually pretty cool. Wouldn't it be really nice if you can go somewhere and you can provision those SharePoint Lookbook sites to any tenant or your tenant and then demonstrate them, or your customer tenant, and they can click through and understand what's possible with the modern SharePoint. And that's really what we're providing here. What's also really cool around this one, I'm not going to deep dive on that topic too much, but these are using this open source templating model, which is called Tenant Templates Engine and Tenant Templates, which actually gives you the capability of creating a one definition, one file which actually can define that we have 3 site collections to provision, Microsoft Teams structures to provision, and Microsoft channels and tabs, which are pointing to those SharePoint sites, which you provision as part of that definition. And it's a one file, which you apply on a tenant, and poof, you have a end result, what you were looking for. So basically, you're able to define solutions which consist from SharePoint site collections, SharePoint sites, configurations, content, branding, and Microsoft Teams structures, which are then pointing back on the SharePoint structures. And that's really cool capability. I'm not going to deep dive on that one right now due to the limitations of the 60 minutes, but something to think through because that's coming available actually in this May release as well. Now, the templating model, which I kind of mentioned here, is something which you can take advantage, not only using the provisioning service, and I'll show you that one in a practice in a second, but you can actually take advantage of this templating model also using your own code. So the provisioning engine behind of the scenes, which we use for creating site collections and used for creating Microsoft Teams together with site collections and configurations and branding to these tenants, is available for you as a NuGet package. You can call that using a PowerShell as well. So it's up to you, again, how do you want to take advantage of that engine. What's also really cool about the service, which I'm going to show you in a second again, that's going to be also open sourced within a few weeks. We're still waiting for a few bureaucracy things to sign off, so we're able to actually release that service as an open source solution, how to build multi-tenant, secure applications which are hosted in Azure, but then they're operating against SharePoint Online. Probably a pretty nice asset for you to take advantage as a developer as well. And behind of the scenes, everything is obviously using the Microsoft Graph, using the SharePoint REST APIs and CSM APIs and all of that, because we're behind of the scenes, we're using the native APIs which are available in the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 level. Now, let's actually have an example of this one in practice. And let me actually go to the service. And service is right now available in the address of provisioning SharePointPnP.com. And this is, like I said, it's a multi-tenant Azure AD, Azure hosted application. You need to be a tenant administrator to be able to use this. If you feel bad on giving pretty high permissions for this application, you can actually use PowerShell, or you can use code also to take advantage of this template. But the whole idea of this one is that we, as a Microsoft, we provide you a polished set of templates and example content which you can use, up to the level of the SharePoint Starter Kit, which was the complex reference solution, and you're able to easily install these to be available in any tenant of the world. Or in the future, we actually going to bet more and more on Microsoft-provided solutions like a custom learning for Office 365, which our Fast Track is using as a reference solution for modern experiences as well. But let's actually have an example how this actually works. So you come to this URL, you select to have a look on the templates, what are available in the catalog, which will be evolving as well. We will be providing additional set of templates in the future. You see a nice looking template. So this is actually exactly what my customer was looking for, and I need to do a live demo on this one to them tomorrow. You can actually check the template out. You can click Add to your tenant, and it's going to do an authorization against the Azure AD. In my case, I've already consented this application to needed permissions, so it's not going to take too long. And then it's going to ask me, okay, so where do you actually want, what is the URL where you want this one to be provisioned? So let me zoom here. We want to have an example content provision to my tenant, and I'm running in the Contoso 027 tenant. What is the URL you want to actually use on this? So let's actually do a build workshop as the demo here. And I can actually define also, it's validating the site URL. First of all, is it available against my tenant? In this case, it is. You can technically apply on top of existing sites as well. Then it's asking my email, so where we want to have a notification when the provisioning is completed. And I can potentially, if I want, and if there is custom themes, I can apply a custom theme on top of the site automatically as well. So it's going to be looking based on the customer branding or your custom branding immediately. In my case, let's keep it simple because this then is faster to get provisioned. It's validating pre-requirements, making sure that it's my tenant has the needed app catalog or whatever configuration needed for the template. And then it asks me to configure the functionality and confirm. and we get the provisioning actually moving. And what happens now is that behind of the scenes, this engine, which is again completely open source, built together with community, built together with MVPs and non-MVPs, together with community, is now actually operating against the tenant, and it's applying that template available to the tenant to be as a starting point for whatever I wanted that template to actually be. Now, like mentioned, we have quite a few templates already available in the service, so you can actually see quite a lot of those SharePoint lookbook sites and SharePoint lookbook designs available for you to take advantage. So you're able to create multiple sites and request multiple sites to get provisioned at the same time. And what's important to realize also that I can actually spin up these as many as I want. Obviously, it doesn't cost you anything. So I can just say, let's do landing 111, so it's definitely unique. And I can just add that one to be running against my tenant as well. And there we go, I will have a nice looking landing demo available, which I can then extend with my third-party extensibility as a starting point. Let me actually confirm that. And there we go. Also, like mentioned, I'm waiting for the provisioning to get completed, but you can find here SharePoint Starter Kit. SharePoint Starter Kit is definitely much more complicated scenario. It is a reference solution which is provisioning multiple site collections, hub site definitions. It is actually provisioning additional 17 web parts and 7 different extensions, custom designs, and custom themes to the tenant by using, again, a few clicks of a button, which is pretty cool. Now, let's go to my email. Let's double check, not my Teams. Let's go to my email. Let's double check if my email confirmation is here. We have actually our Contoso Workshop Contoso Workshop site provision. And I can actually click the link, and voila, that was with the URL build workshop. So I'm not cheating. We created a new site-looking site collection, which is having example content, which you can then extend and modify based on your business requirements. Is that useful for you? Yay! Cool. Good. And the whole intention here is that definitely based on your requirements, based on obviously what you then build on top of this, now you have something to extend for. Not just using the out-of-the-box capabilities, something which is cool-looking, example content, demo content, which you can then further extend, like mentioned, with your own extensibility. Cool. Let me get back in here and talk about a few additional things as well. So we talked about the SharePoint framework. We talked about the modern experiences. In build, you've probably seen this. Microsoft is pushing heavily Microsoft Teams, which makes perfect sense. It is a great new solution. It's a relatively new solution, obviously, comparing to SharePoint, which has legacy from 2001, right? But SharePoint, Microsoft Teams has a really cool extensibility model as well. And a lot of the customers are moving more and more using the Microsoft Teams. Well, if we think about the role of SharePoint and the Microsoft Teams, somebody might think that are they actually overlapping or not? And well, potentially yes, in a collaboration level. But actually behind of the Microsoft Teams, every single file what you store in Microsoft Teams is actually stored in SharePoint. Every single experience, or pretty much a lot of the experiences what you see in Microsoft Teams are actually backed by the SharePoint behind of the scenes. And that's actually how they, Microsoft Teams people, saw the SharePoint framework. And they started getting highly interested on, well, wait a minute, we're already using a lot of the SharePoint framework behind of the scenes, and you have this awesome new development model called SharePoint Framework. What if we would actually start building together and consistent extensibility model for Microsoft Teams tabs? And as part of this journey, we executed this preview program where we had quite a few partners closely involved, influencing on the design which we came up with together with Microsoft Teams engineering. And these are the companies which we have a permission to show the logo. There's quite a few other companies involved in the preview program as well, where we then piloted and created the model to use a same consistent experience, same consistent development experience across SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. And what it means in practice is that the same web part, same development tooling, the same advantages of not needing to go to the Azure AD, not needing those permission management or complexity and the simplification of everything, is now available in the Microsoft Teams as well. So you're able to build your Microsoft Teams tabs by using the SharePoint Framework tooling, which has been proven and it's widely adopted already by numerous partners. So SharePoint Framework is the way for systems integrators and enterprise developers to build solutions in SharePoint and in Teams. And what's really, really important here and to understand is that there's multiple advantages of making this happen. And I'll show you this one in practice, how simple it is to actually make the extensibility work also in Teams. But first of all, there's automatic hosting, because the hosting happens in SharePoint. So you don't actually have to worry about where's your Azure application or where's your enterprise solution hosted, because actually SharePoint is automatically taking care of all of that for you. Super important thing. There's easy access to the Graph APIs. Well, it's nothing more than actually granting the permissions using the tenant admin UIs, and then you can call the API, and that's it. It's a really simple way for them, the tab implementation, to access any of the contextual data. It's a simple deployment. It's a single file which you deploy to a single location, click a button, poof, it's available in Microsoft Teams. That's pretty cool. I'll show you that one in practice in a second as well. But more importantly, the last bullet point is the important one. It is exactly the same implementation. So I can now build one web part which I can actually expose as a Microsoft Teams tab. So I don't need to implement a customization for Microsoft Teams separately and then do something magical to make it work in the Microsoft SharePoint side. No, it's actually one setting in a one JSON file to make it work in the Microsoft Teams. And that's actually pretty cool. And before we actually show that one in practice and just showing how the functionality works then inside of the Teams, we actually work with the Microsoft Teams people to do the same thing kind of a vice versa. So they actually have a lot of ISV applications which are using the SaaS model. So people like SurveyMonkey or Jira are actually exposing their SaaS applications already in Microsoft Teams. And we work together with Microsoft Teams engineering to support all of those applications also to work in SharePoint. So if you want, and if you have built an ISV solution, or if you are an ISV or ISV provider, your actual existing Microsoft Teams solutions are already today working in the SharePoint side just by deploying them on SharePoint. Because we wanted to make this as simple as possible for all of our developers. That's actually pretty cool. Now, let's actually have a practice and have an example of a Microsoft tab built with the SharePoint framework and what does it mean in practice. So I'm not going to, again, deep dive on the code because I'd rather want to spend time on giving you an ideas and showing a lot of demos. But technically, in this case, we're going to use a web part, and I'm just going to show you in practice what are the steps of making that web part then available in the Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to use the modern SharePoint communication side. I'm going to use, for example, a nice looking design for creating a page. And in this page, I'm going to then add a web part here. And this web part, let's see, where do we want to put that? That's a good location. Clicky, clicky, clickety, clickety, click. Okay, let me scroll down. Okay, that's a good location, so that's fine. Let me actually delete here leads. And that's a leads web part, and I'm adding that one on a page. So this is a imaginary, let's say, LOB integration web part. So it's a web part which we actually showed originally already last year in the SharePoint conference. But basic idea is that this web part is securely calling an Azure function based on the identity who's using the SharePoint page and then collecting information from the LOB system. So leads in this case, but it could be anything. It could be sales, it could be inventory, or it could be any data. So it is a SharePoint web part, a custom SharePoint web part built for enterprise scenario. Now, these web parts, starting from relatively recent versions, they actually have multiple ways of exposing themselves inside of the Office 365. And this is actually the manifest file of a SharePoint Framework web part. Again, I'm not going to deep dive how the web part has been built. It is using Node.js, NPM, JavaScript, and TypeScript behind the scenes. We have awesome tutorial available around that one. But the way how I control that web part to be available in Microsoft Teams is just by modifying the supported hosts option and repackaging my code, and that's it. So now what I can do is that by default it's in SharePoint, but I can actually say, first of all, that I want this web part to be a SharePoint full page. Well, that's interesting. Let's have a look on what's that. So what is a SharePoint full page rendering? But then also there was the third option right now, which is a Teams tab web part. So cool. So the same web part exposed as a Teams tab. And the only thing what I need to do now is repackage the code, deploy to the tenant, and voila, we can actually see the same web part in multiple different other exposed scenarios. So let me get back on the site. I'm going to start with the single page application experience. So I'm going to create here a new page. But I'm not going to use a template for creating the modern page. I'm going to actually use an app for creating the page. And in my app right now, I don't have a nice picture for it, but I have a leads application, which I'm actually installing to the site as a single page, as an app page. And here I can actually provide a name for it. So it's no longer a web part, because it actually, even though you can actually configure that, let me do a build demo here and close that one. But it's no longer a web part. It is actually a page where the web part is being rendered as a one page, and I'm able to operate with the web part any way I want. So one way of rendering stuff. But this means that the user cannot drag and drop multiple web parts. It is an app page inside of the SharePoint. And then you are still having all of the advantages of SharePoint. So you're in the context of user, you have access on graph, and all of that stuff. Authentication, and then you can easily access, for example, Azure AD functions or Azure functions securely using the SharePoint platform. Okay, that's kind of cool, and there probably are scenarios which we want to use this kind of things. But what about the Microsoft Teams? That was kind of an interesting scenario. Now, first of all, in Microsoft Teams, obviously you can extend Microsoft Teams, and you can have Microsoft Teams exposing SharePoint data relatively easily. So you'll just configure Microsoft Teams tabs, point to the SharePoint. But if you want to really build an enterprise applications, then we don't talk about showing a page. We actually talk about the fact that we create a tab, and we create a tab available. So let me actually do that in here as a new tab. Let me actually do it in here and create a new tab available. We can actually see that I have a leads web part available, lead solution available. It's no longer a web part because it's Microsoft Teams tab. I can select that, click Save, and exactly the same code, exactly the same piece of code, with that one attribute change in the JSON file is now running as a Microsoft Teams tab. And it, by the way, works in the Teams mobile, and it works in the Teams desktop without any problems nowadays. Isn't that cool? One piece of code. Woohoo! There we go. Thank you. And this is already GA, this is available right now for you to take advantage. And like I said, if you're using the latest versions of SharePoint Framework, SharePoint Framework 1.8 or newer, the latest version will be actually released today, 1.8.2, and which have some additional support like Node.js 10 support. You can actually add your web parts to be rendered as a Teams tab, and then they will be exposed as a Teams applications inside of the tenant. So really simple way of implementing functionalities and solutions. Cool. That's kind of cool. We still have 15 minutes roughly to go through. And that's really cool. So now we have SharePoint, and now we have Microsoft Teams implementation. What about the other stuff in Office 365? Wouldn't it actually be kind of cool if we do other stuff? Which is actually an interesting scenario. But before we go there, actually, let's talk about also the fact that just recapping the Microsoft SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. So obviously, the same implementation from a developer perspective, you can actually then expose your extensibility using the Microsoft Microsoft Teams tabs or then the SharePoint pages. And we're looking into further aligning these solutions together. And there will be improvements announced again for many of the scenarios and integration with SharePoint, also in the upcoming SharePoint conference in a few weeks. But everything is based on the fact that we're using Microsoft Graph, getting contextual data, exposing the information which is available inside of the organization or the customer's data, user-specific information, and user APIs. Now, like I said, That's kind of cool. That's really cool. We have now Microsoft Teams, we have SharePoint, and we have a one implementation model using the modern tooling. What about the other services? What about the other stuff in the Microsoft 365 or Office 365 level? Wouldn't it be actually kind of cool if we would have a one way of implementing enterprise scenarios, and we would be able to then expose solutions in the more additional applications as well? And this is now announced first time publicly in preview. While it's not yet available, coming soon to preview, is the support for building Office add-ins using the SharePoint Framework tooling. So exactly the same tooling, exactly the same capabilities, exactly the same possibilities. I'm going to walk through what it means in practice, one step at a time on the slides. It's going to be a hectic slide in the end, or after 3 steps. But basically, our objective was really to simplify also the Office add-ins development. Because one of the big challenges in the Office add-ins, the #1 challenge everybody was having, is that where do I host my customization? How do I get that Azure AD web app? Maybe for a developer, or maybe at least for Microsoft, it's like, well, you have an Azure subscription. But then when you go to the enterprise scenarios, enterprise customers, it's not like you can get those Azure applications and permissions by snapping of fingers. Quite often, there's a process, and it can take time. Now, we do have SharePoint. As long as you're running in the context of Office 365, SharePoint is behind the scenes. So why wouldn't we take advantage of hosting stuff from SharePoint? So installing that application, first of all, SharePoint Framework solution deployed to Office 365 tenant using the tenant app catalog. We're looking into, by the way, aligning on that one as well in the future. So right now there's multiple app catalogs. We're looking into aligning to a single app catalog potentially in future, but no ETA on that one. So right now you're deploying an SPFx solution to your Office 365 tenant. You activate that to be available in the tenant app catalog, and you activate that to be available in the Office 365 solutions. And after that, you can take advantage of all of the goodies what we have with SharePoint Framework. Automatic hosting, easy deployment, CDN, optimized CDN for the experiences, loading the application across the world as easy as possible. That easy access to Microsoft Graph, access on SharePoint data, access on storing data, for example, on SharePoint lists if needed in your experience. So your application can easily store simple data in SharePoint lists behind the scenes, and then exposing that in the Office client as well. And then being exposed in the client. Now, I'm going to do a quick demo on the panel side of the things, and this is super early, but we're looking potentially making this in preview already in 1.9 release of SharePoint Framework. In preview experience, which is planned to go out within, how would I put this, weeks rather than months. That's probably the right way of putting that. I can't promise you an exact date, because probably if we fail on that date, then you'll be mad on me. So I'd rather say something generic. But how does this work in practice? So again, this is relatively rough and relatively early, but you'll get a preview on how it actually might work. So let me go back on my demo site, and here I have an application. Let me actually make sure that my web part is running, and again, early, I'm running this as a Hello World web part stuff and Hello World web part experience. This is a document which I have right now in the web client, and this will definitely work in the normal desktop clients as well, and also on the mobile clients. Intended to work where the Office add-ins will be working as well. In this document, there are certain random texts. So there's a kind of a chapter here which is having terms like MOS and MS Exchange, and then I've added some lorem ipsum just to fill up the document space. Now, in this case, I actually included my SPFx application already as a panel to give you insights on how this could actually look like. And it's relatively simple application. So it's a relatively simple find and replace functionality. Where did my mouse go? There we go. So I can, as an example, I can operate from my add-in and find there a MOS is included in here. How many of you remember what the MOS actually means? It's Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, yes. Which probably MOS isn't really a good term for a product, but that's a separate discussion, whoever came up with that. But sure, that's one way of operating. We're able to talk from the SharePoint framework or from the add-in to the actual document. We're able to find the information from there. So we're basically using the Office JS for talking to the document. We're able to do replacements. So where I'm able to do something like technical documentation. I'm going to flip that one as a doc. Obviously, I can operate with the document as well, and everything is working properly, or maybe it isn't. So let me actually do a replace, and that isn't working properly. Let me do that, and do I need to do a replace from there? No. Okay, not working that one. I said pretty early, but still. I can then do something like get code words, because I'm in the context of the tenant, so I can easily talk to my SharePoint, or to any other data source in the Office 365. So in this case, this list of code words, which is relatively ugly, and I do know that this is relatively rough, is coming from a list in SharePoint. In the SharePoint Online behind of the tenant, which is hosting the actual document. So I'm reading that code word list, and then I can do something like replace code words. So we want to replace the MOS, the Microsoft Office SharePoint server, and if I do replace code words, we can actually go back in the document, and we can see that the MOS has been modified. So we're using fully, we're able to talk to the document, we're able to modify the document, we're able to read the document and do everything what is there available from the Office JS perspective. Now, if you were yesterday in the keynote, we've actually showed something related on the future of the Office add-ins, and we are absolutely in line and talking with those people as well. So we're looking into having the SharePoint framework as an extensibility model in the future for Office add-ins as well. Whenever the modern preview, what is it, Fluent framework, which we released yesterday? I can't remember what we use always on the public naming. Sorry? Fluid framework. Thank you. Fluid framework. Thank you very much. We keep on changing all of this, what's public and what we call it internally, so it's really hard to keep up with these code names. But yeah, so we are working with these people closely as well, and if there is like I said, this is going to plan to go to preview in 1.9 release of SharePoint Framework, and if there is interest in the audience and the developers to actually use the SharePoint Framework as the development model for Office add-ins, and using the SharePoint behind of the scenes as the hosting mechanism, it will definitely go live and GA later on this year. But it's really also dependent on you. Is this a functionality which is interesting? Is this a model which is interesting for you as well? And I can see numerous people nodding. That's always a good sign. Woohoo! That's really good. But again, one single way of implementing extensibility across Office 365, and it could be even the same code base, because the same way as we can detect that am I actually running in the Microsoft Teams tab as a web part, or am I Microsoft Teams tab, or am I a web part, I can actually detect am I actually running in the context of an Office client, and I can change my behavior. So all of this contextual data is available for developers as well. So super important thing. Cool. Now, a few more slides before we close up, and I have booth duty after that, but I'll come back on that one in a second. So first of all, if you're interested on SharePoint Framework, if you're interested in our open source assets and projects, what we do, we actually execute once a week, at least once a week. We have a community calls, public community calls. All of that information is available in AKMS SP PnP. That will redirect you to our SharePoint Dev documentation community section, where you can find our community call details, our YouTube channel details, our documentation details, open source projects, and all of that stuff. It's a relatively easy URL to remember. We think this in three kind of different ways. It's around learning, which is the documentation around SharePoint development, reusing, which is the open sourcing of things, and then sharing. If you're interested in contributing your knowledge on the benefit of others, we absolutely embrace that as well. It's not a mandatory thing, but obviously it's always good to have more people in the open source projects involved. If you think about this particular session, really the key points here to remember is to build SharePoint with SharePoint Framework, web parts and extension. This is future-proven model. We're heavily betting on it. It is by far the most widely adapted extensibility model which we've ever seen in Office 365. It is blowing, it was a massive surprise from an adaptation perspective. I'm unallowed, unfortunately, to give you exact numbers, also because the way we calculate the usage is, how would I put it, it's semi-scientific. So I would have to explain how the calculation logic works for 15 minutes, so you would be able to understand that. But it's by far the most widely used extensibility in Office 365. Take advantage of the open source projects and assets. So hopefully the stuff what I showed today is helping you to execute on a day-to-day basis. All of that stuff is available already today, which is a good thing. So when you go home on Thursday or Friday or next week, you can take advantage of them already today. So not just the future's promise, except for the Office settings. And also extend and integrate with Microsoft Teams and using Microsoft Graph. I think the key scenario for SharePoint Framework really is building contextual experiences using the Microsoft Graph and then exposing the same capability in SharePoint or as a Microsoft Teams tab, or in the future as an Office setting, or whatever will be the next steps after that. So we'll see. Also, one reminder, please sign up for Office 365 Developer Program. This is actually your free tenant, which will renew automatically once a year as long as you use it for developer usage. So there's an automatic telemetry, which is double-checking how do you use the tenant. If you use it in a wrong way, which means that you're using that for production usage, we will detect that, and then it's not going to renew. But if you use it for developer usage, you put your add-ins in, you test it for customizations, use app catalogs and all of that, it will automatically renew once a year. And that's a really, really great thing. Also, depending on your interests, we actually provide you content packs. So in the future, there will be a one click of a button which will provision you example SharePoint structures and content and users and images and Microsoft Teams tabs and all of those using the Office 365 Developer Program dashboard. So really great resource. Let's take advantage of that one. Absolutely great thing. But that's it from my side.